Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Every week when I hear the stories and meet the guests, I certainly often recognize that we share a lot in common, but different. You know, our walk with Jesus Christ, our openness to the work of the Holy Spirit in our life, being open and drawn to the Catholic Church, and then other issues. And tonight I'm excited. Our guest is Jonathan Bading, and we share music, which I'm excited to hear about. He's a former Calvinist, and that we share too. So, former musician, Calvinist, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Marcus. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm anxious to hear your story because we walked in similar footprints. But let me back up and start from the beginning on your journey, if you would.
I was born and raised in Northern Virginia, Fairfax County, right outside of Washington, D.C. I grew up in as I mentioned, Calvinism, to the Presbyterian Church in America, which is a more conservative, larger denomination of Presbyterianism. And I have my two parents, and I have an older brother as well. My parents kind of entered into Presbyterianism actively as well. They made the decision to enter into the Presbyterian Church. So my mother kind of grew up, while her parents didn't necessarily attend church, her grandmother would take her to Methodist church every week. And that's their old stock, Eastern Shore of Maryland fishermen, wharfmen, and they're all Methodist through and through for the last 400 years. So she kind of grew up with that, and then in the 70s when kind of the Jesus People movement and everything, she was kind of looking towards more of an evangelical expression of the faith, and kind of came into the Presbyterian Church, McLean Presbyterian Church, which is the church I grew up in, right outside the Capitol, which actually has become sort of a flagship in the Mid-Atlantic. And then my father, I believe both of his parents were Lutheran practicing, and then they, in the 50s, my grandparents then kind of became, through an influence of a friend of theirs, became sort of fundamentalist Baptist. So my dad ended up going to Bob Jones University and grew up in that whole world as well. But then while he was at Bob Jones, began reading some Calvinist literature, even though it was contraband, and from there he kind of read himself into Calvinism. There's a lot of funny stories with that experience, but we can leave those away. Anyway, so they both kind of came into Presbyterianism actively, and then both my parents, educationally, they studied music. So my father is an organist, and my mother's a vocalist, and so from the get-go, sacred music has been a part of our family's life in all its various expressions. But I think some of the earliest virtues or things our family found significant was beauty, and was also that music for us was always connected to the divine. It wasn't ever a sort of a self-serving thing. It was the divine practice. Even secular music, my mother did opera, she did art song, things like that, lieder. But that was still... There was still, in music itself, there was still a divinity.
There was a prayerful aspect or a proclamation aspect?
Probably proclamation and just the fact that music elevates in its nature. It elevates. It should elevate at least, properly done. And so my earliest memories of church were being there forever because my dad would play all the Sunday services, and then I would go in the morning sometimes with him, and if I got up early to go with him, he'd get me, McDonald's or something like that on the way into church, which was a nice memory. And then my mother was in the choir, and then she directed our children's choir, which my brother and I sang in. So we were always we were always turning down the lights, as on our way out, we were always closing out the church, it seemed. But that still has an impact on you as a child, is that the Sunday was a very significant day of our week.
Well, I know that in that world there are things called PKs, which are pastors' kids.
Yes, right.
Are there OKs?
Perhaps organist kids. I probably we felt like we were able to enter the sanctuary, and I'd go and see my dad at the organ or turn pages for him, and we're very related. We're close cousins to PKs, I'm sure. So anyway, that was kind of my early memories. And
one other thing before you go on.
Yeah.
During that time period, I'm guessing your parents might be my age. I know that I was PCUSA, so it was a little bit larger, had more liberal Presbyterians in it than the PCA.
Yeah.
But there was a movement in that time to become more liturgical.
Yes.
Was that happening in the PCA?
I can only speak to McLean at the time, and I grew up in an interesting era because my parents, my whole perspective of what the church music was, and what the state of church music at our Presbyterian church was that we were coming out of a good period of it, and we were kind of in a transitional period, but things were still sort of good. So, for example, we were still religiously using the hymnal in the pew while I was growing up as a child. I heard the organ every week. My father did preludes, he did postludes. He, like I said, accompanied the hymns on the organ. We had the influence of a praise band at the time, but it was more conservative. Piano, maybe some strings, nothing too edgy yet. Yeah. And then, but at the same time, especially the big Easter and Christmas were actually very, I would say, solemn. I think that our pastor at the time, interestingly enough, he was sort of at a seeker-friendly mindset, but also had these sort of high church leanings too. So when it came to Christmas, we had the Advent candles out. We put greens in the sanctuary. We sang Advent hymnody, and then Christmas was, candle lit and lovely. And those are very warm memories of feeling like you're part of something greater than yourself.
Yeah, I had a Protestant friend of mine who did a PhD study on church music, and his conclusion was that often the music of the moment that's most popular was the music that was popular in the last renewal.
Interesting, yeah.
Because the people whose lives changed back then are now in the position choosing the music.
The power, yes.
So we're seeing music now that became really popular back then, but is now becoming, and that was true in the Protestant world. I think a little bit that's true in the Catholic world.
Yeah, well, Catholic world's I've discovered that's a whole different can of worms. But there are parallels, Okay. There's a phrase that, when Rome sneezes, the rest of the world gets sick, that kind of thing. Like, I think a lot of the stuff that happened, I think, with liturgical shifting in Roman Catholicism affected, it was all the same spirit, all the same movement. But at the same, so my early experiences with church music,
having all of that.
We were having all of it, yeah. And I think so you had a not a camp, that's too strong of a word, but you had people who preferred perhaps some of the things happening in contemporary Christian music, but at the same time it was still this. You had our whitewashed Presbyterian walls, and we had the red hymnal, and at least that's my image of it. I could have been wrong, but that was my image. That was something given to me. And my earliest memories as a musician too I learned the sight read. I learned to sing parts at a young age because I read the hymnal. My mother would say, "This is the alto. You sing the alto. I'll sing the soprano," or whatever these things. And I was terrible at first, I'm sure, but
I miss having hymnals with all four parts.
Well, as a Catholic, in my current position, I'm seeking one that has 4-part hymnody because. What's the point of doing hymnody if you can't sing parts? I digress. There's my brother and I always talk about that's very formative to us. Was the hymnal and was singing this music, and then my earliest memories as a child are also being put to bed in the evening and hearing my father practice the piano downstairs, and then my mother would go in and they would sing show tunes together or sing whatever art song, and lovely. Yeah.
Wow, what a gift.
Yeah.
Did as an OK, had you found Jesus?
I think, yes. I always felt close to the Lord as a child. I never felt a dissonance there, at least when I was a child. When I was entering into the age of reason, I felt like that's when things began to change. Yeah. I think where things kind of went, where I began to find some dissonance and probably an awakening was to the age of reason. I was on 7 or 8 or 9, and you begin intentionally sinning and all these things. And a big negative influence on my life, which entered in that time, was, as a millennial, we were the first generation to really grow up with the internet. And for me, it was early exposure to internet pornography, which was a huge aspect of my, I would say, staggering in the faith. Definitely, obviously, as I understand now, of being a mortal sin and staining my baptismal innocence that I received in baptism, albeit outside of Rome. But that was at a very young age falling into that, and then never having really a solution to the problem. And I remember being a young adolescent, 11, 12, 13, and we would have these candid youth group evenings at our Presbyterian church where everyone, came clean about this kind of stuff. But it still never offered a solution. It was pretty much just like, stop it, stop. It's not right. Which I'm glad they were saying it was not right. There's more perverse teaching and other areas of the church about that kind of stuff. I'm glad they said it wasn't right, but it still wasn't offering a solution to what I recognized now was an addiction. And so that was sort of an area where I really felt like my spiritual life began to really stray. But then at the same time, what was healing for me, it was keeping me, I think, moving towards maybe work in the church, or what was this notion of sacred music. And some of the big influences on that in my life were I had a choir director I went to a private Christian school in Fairfax. I had a choir director who I had sung under since I was very young, first grade all the way up through my senior year. And she was very influential in my life. She was an Anglican. And I remember one time I was singing in choir we had a little honors ensemble that we had in high school, and we were singing with her in choir. And we were singing what now is I really consider one of my salvation pieces. It was the Ave Verum Corpus by Byrd, William Byrd, who's the great Catholic recusant composer. He pretty much survived the Reformation by being Elizabeth's favorite composer, So she's like, I can't kill him. He's too good. His music's too beautiful. Same with Tallis. So, but we were singing the Byrd Ave Verum Corpus, which of course the Ave Verum is it's a Eucharistic text, right? Hail, true body, born of the Virgin Mary. Hail, true blood. The blood and water flowing from the side. And we were singing this piece, and the beauty alone was stunning, and I was loving, and I always had an affection for Renaissance polyphony that was growing. And then one time my teacher stopped, and you could see she was getting a little weepy, and she was getting very emotional. And she said, "Do you not realize that when you sing this music, you are manifesting the crucifixion?" And I was like, that was a eureka moment for me. The light bulb went on. I said, that's why music is, this is why it's so appealing to me. It's not this garnish in worship even. It's so much more than that. We do manifest these realities. Art does that, right? And that these aren't things that we even create. A proper Platonic understanding of art, of music, theater, anything, is that we ourselves are not actually creating these things. These things already exist in the cosmos, and we're merely, opening the curtain to it.
Which is why music needs to be taken so seriously.
Yes.
Because of its power. It can, as your teacher said, you are expressing the very incarnation, the resurrection.
Yeah.
You do that. Or that same music can draw you into something else.
Yes.
As Augustine said,
yes.
You sing, you pray twice.
Yes.
So, there's a power there that you must be a steward of.
Yes. Yes.
And that needs to be fleshed out. But to be a steward of it means being responsible for what one does with this gift.
Yeah.
And your teacher was doing that.
Yes, right.
As you said, you went to tears because she realized not only what it meant for her, but what it meant for you.
Yes.
And wanted to make sure you understand what you're getting
doing
here.
Is that you're not being moved just because you're purely for aesthetic, but the fact that you're entering into the mysteries. And that was the first time that was ever really articulated for me in such a way. And that alone began really having me ask all sorts of questions of, not only like what's the role of music in my life, but what's the role of music in the church, and I guess providentially enough, at this time entering into high school, in our later years of high school, where should I begin? There's two trails here. One was on the church front. Our church began going through sort of it was almost a divide. It was pretty. There was a lot of tension in the room over the fact that we had a new pastor, and we were kind of switching what we were doing with our liturgical music. The organ was being kind of pushed to the side, which obviously there was a personal offense there too, hit close to home, obviously my dad being the organist, and the organist there for 20 plus years.
Whenever you switch from the organ to maracas, it makes a huge difference.
It does.
Our guest is Jonathan Bading. I just wanted to make sure to get that
Bading,
in
you're correct, long A.
Okay, so a new pastor, new priorities,
exactly.
no understanding of how to express the faith.
Yes, and so the whole, it kind of felt like the carpet was ripped from under our feet, and we had a new worship minister come in, and it wasn't just contemporary; it was very contemporary, very quick, and you realize that a lot of people began to be really affected by this, and worship, or any notion of worship at all, began very stressful. And my mother, God bless her, she's much more expressive with her emotions than my father. My father's quite the opposite, extrovert, introvert, opposites attract. So, but then when I began to see my father really really take on this burden and really kind of be very upset. I mean, we would come home from church on Sundays and eat lunch together, and we would just be vitriolic. I mean, our conversation would be vitriolic overall, how angry we were over the things that were happening, because it would really hit close to home. And then we had to have so many talks as a church about it, and there were all sorts of arguments and camps. You know, Presbyterian polity, you know, you have to, everyone has to do everything all at once, you know, you have to agree on it as a congregation. And I remember the pastor came out and pretty much said, you know, all this comes down to his preference, and as long as the text we're singing is valid or theologically correct, then does it really matter if the music matters? And I went going like, does it really come down to preference? I mean, does beauty come down to preference? The Psalms say that God is the perfection of beauty. Then how can we?
It's taking music flippantly. Beauty's just in the eye of the beholder. There's no substance to it. It's all of that,
and that's never even been held by the church. And so while this was happening at our church, at my school, interestingly enough, our school was mainly Protestant. There were a handful of Catholics, one Orthodox family that I knew of, but I would say generally Baptist, Presbyterian, Lutherans, and Anglicans. And we had this group of Anglican priests that were our theology, upper level theology teachers, you know. And so I took this church history class as a junior in high school. And this class was one of these that changed my life. And we began reading the Fathers, and we read On the Incarnation by Athanasius, which is...
Oh, the classic.
And I began connecting. There was the exact same year that we had this Ave Verum Corpus discussion, right? So we began to connect this idea that Christ became flesh, and therefore he sanctifies every single aspect of creation, and that the flesh isn't something that we just ignore, but the physical reality matters. And then I'm tying that to this notion of, okay, well then liturgical music matters. And then on the other side, you know, it quietly, secretly, I'm festering morally, you know, in the sin I've already mentioned. And that has just been, you know, very difficult and gotten me all sorts of trouble. And so then the early church is offering me this solution there with the sacraments and this notion that God touches us physically, you know, that he doesn't just, it's not just spiritual action, but that there's this, that we are physically redeemed, and that this body, that God, I remember coming home from one day, my mother and I used to have wonderful conversations on the way home from school, because I just began saying like, Mom, have you heard about this stuff before? And we had one conversation in particular where I began talking about how we were talking about the Ascension, and he ascended into heaven. And for the first time ever, I realized that was a bodily ascension, and that Christ reigns on the right hand of the Father in his flesh. And my mother and I just like sat there like thinking about that forever. You know, we both kind of had this realization like that's humongous. And I really felt like that mystery, pondering the mystery of the Ascension, right? Really, we actually were doing that at that moment. But that this life really matters, and that it's not just, you know, one stop on the way to heaven. You know, that's not Christianity at all, and the church has never really taught that. And then as a musician, I was sacramentally kind of beginning to think of music in sacramental terms, still opaquely. I was still growing in that. And so in the midst of this kind of crisis in our it was probably my senior year of high school with what was going on in the church, I kind of began vowing myself off of the crisis in the Presbyterian Church, because I wanted to kind of say, maybe I should explore Anglicanism a bit. And these priests had really taken a lot of time to speak to me about these things, and I would go to them at lunch periods and ask them about everything. I mean, and these Anglican priests are hardcore. I mean, they were even on areas like contraception. I would ask them questions about that, and they'd be like, well, I really don't see historic precedent for it ever. You know, so once again, my Catholic formation was already there, and then that is also healing the sinful areas of my life, which really afflicted me as an adolescent. And I began discovering all those things around the same time. So then I began sort of exploring Anglicanism on a cursory level. I began attending services when I could. My parents let me, and then my parents were generally open to it. That's also one of the things I admired about them. They've always been intellectually liberal in the best sense, in the sense that they didn't fear the pursuit of truth wherever it took you. And so they were very okay with me saying, okay, I could be an Anglican. I can begin going to the services here. They liked the priests that I have, and I even brought them. And my dad had a Sunday off.
I would have suspected they would like the liturgy.
And of course, and I've always said that I think my parents have always been that way with. They've always been one step beyond a Calvinistic approach to music, because really the way we were doing music at the Presbyterian Church was not even Calvin's approach to music. We had an organ, so that itself would be, there's no organ in Scripture. So I mean, You're
not just plain songing the Psalms.
No, which has its own beauty, but at the same time, we weren't even doing that. We were kind of Diet Anglican even even then. So all this stuff is rubbing off on me. And then I had a friend at the time in high school who, she was Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, her family was Greek, and she invited me to the Easter Divine Liturgy on the evening one time that year, which was also a providential move because I'd never been to anything like that before, right? So we went into this, it was this warehouse that they had converted into this church, and that itself was an amazing image because there was, you could see the air conditioning unit in the back, but then you have the iconostasis, and you have the smell of incense is just asphyxiating as you go in, and it was an amazing experience. And we're sitting there, and the thing for me that I noticed immediately was that the liturgy just goes on without you, and it proceeds without you, and that there was something there to being there that was totally different than anything I'd ever experienced. And I got hooked. I got absolutely hooked into that notion of the objectivity and the independence of the liturgy. And I was still seeking for that, and I thought the Anglicanism at the time was a satisfactory conclusion to that, a satisfactory answer to that kind of longing. And so then
but not Catholic.
But not, well, here's the interesting thing. So at the same time, this is actually amazing when I think back about it, because how it feels like when God, when he's bringing you into the church, there are things he plants at you at such a young age that don't even flower until decades away, I remember being in high school and I was reading this website called the New Liturgical Movement, which is a Catholic website devoted to ameliorating the Roman liturgy. And they put a big emphasis on the traditional Mass, and they put a big emphasis on how do we effectively reform some of the liturgical abuses that have entered into Roman Catholicism on a humongous level. And the thing that attracted me about this website was that they had the most beautiful photos on this website of these Catholic masses, and the priests had the most beautiful vestments, and the churches themselves were being beautiful. And the thing that really hit me was these priests they'd show these European churches, and these priests would be having these masses there, and they'd be celebrating the Mass at the high altar of this church. And so you have a church, an altarpiece that looks like the altarpiece of Ghent, one of these glorious pieces of Western art, and they would be sacrificing the host they'd be elevating the host on this altar, and it was this combination of that art has this divine purpose, that the altarpiece of Ghent was made to be an altar, not to be a museum piece, and that we as Catholics created these beautiful things that then we used. It was both a pragmatic use and the most beautiful thing we could ever have. It was worthy of the temple. So that really began to influence me. But then the thing I had was, once again, Catholicism was still kind of stigmatized, and I wasn't too comfortable with it yet, but I hadn't seen an honest expression of that kind of beauty before. The only really exposure I'd had to the Catholic Church at the time was going to a couple of funerals with, I would say your typical suburban liturgy, nothing to write home about.
Maybe a guitar that wasn't tuned well.
Yeah, right. Or, someone who shouldn't be singing an Ave Maria on the piano while playing, wherever it's going to be, and going this is kind of odd. That's what really kind of kept me in Anglicanism for a long time. So then I go...
Because Anglicanism is really your only option unless you want to go High Church Lutheran.
Exactly.
Really, Anglican's about it.
But even still, the Anglicans that were influencing me were still showing the divide with Luther. They were saying Luther, really was this reformer. And their opinion was that the Anglican Church did retain some sort of apostolic succession, that was kind of their vein. They weren't, I would say, Anglo-Catholics, but they were old school prayer book, Tractarian Anglicans through and through, and they taught me the scriptures really well, and they taught me the early fathers really well. So it was a remarkable thing. So then I go into college. I'd been studying organ around the same time. My dad I'd been playing piano. I was getting really interested in choral music, was thinking about choral conducting. I loved singing this choral music. I was a good singer, and I loved that world. But I knew that I needed to still keep up my keyboard skills, and my piano at the time was kind of festering. And in retrospect, when I think back about it, I think that a lot of the lack of discipline that I had in a lot of areas of my life probably resulted from this addiction that I kept very closeted. And that
that's so much the danger of what the internet was happening for your generation.
Yes.
Because the parents, we suspected that this is can have a bad side. We all did, and we were saying about it.
Yeah.
I don't think we truly realized how pervasive
How easy.
it could become, how pervasive it could become.
No, there was an ignorance there, and I don't have bad feelings there. It was.
Yeah.
And I mean, now I see it as the cross that God gave me to bear, and that's a profound honor, hard honor, but a profound cross, and one that I know I have a lot of solidarity with peers over that, which is also a lovely thing. But I look back at my discipline and the lack of discipline I had, and particularly as a keyboardist. Like I said, I was confident as a chorister, as a singer, and succeeded in those areas. But as a keyboardist, I was kind of festering. And I think for me, I was very tense, and I got very stressed while I was playing, terribly nervous while I played. And I never really understood the bodily aspect of how to play. I never could, sing through the keyboard. I just kind of always felt like I was playing on top of it. I was awkward. I was clumsy. I carried it really hard in the shoulders and the arms. And then the thing that I think was really in the back, back of the neck.
I know that.
Yeah, leaning.
Okay.
And then sweating like a pig while I played, and I never had poise like I did when I sang. And I thought I was a goner. I was doomed to that fate, And as a pianist, and I really wasn't connecting on it. Aesthetically, I was connecting on. I wanted to achieve higher forms of music, but I just was with the teacher I had. I wasn't getting there. But I also didn't have the solution to this stress and this lack of discipline, the lack of ability to calm everything and kind of start the patience to start again and kind of reteach myself technique and everything. I thought I was a goner. So my dad at the time, being an organist, said, now it's time to, take the family craft here and come to the good side. And he sent me off to a camp, a 1-week organ camp with the kind of an introduction for piano students into the organ. And I really began to love it. I met a teacher there that ended up being my teacher for my last 2 years of school. And I really kind of began to fall in love with the organ. The nice thing with the organ was that it allowed me an opportunity to start again, to relearn some aspects of technique, and then to also say that this technique is different from piano, and maybe I can just kind of remodel myself as a keyboardist. And then also say, I would express to my organ teacher, I said, I have a real interest in doing choral music and doing sacred music. And he said to me, pragmatically, become an organist and you can do all that stuff. Because there is as we talked about earlier, a dearth of organists. I mean, there's really a need. And there's a surplus of choral people and a surplus of pianists, there's a surplus of all of that. But if you go organ, you go right to the heart of it. And then you can do everything else. Church will hire an organist. They won't hire just a choral director, unless it's a very big church. And that was very pragmatic advice, but also I think it guided me a long way. So I was playing the organ, wanted to continue doing sacred music. Some of these sacramental things were influencing me. So I applied to this school in West Michigan called Hope College, which is a member of the RCA, the Reformed Church in America, Dutch Reformed. And they had a very good organ program that all emphasized, a lot of interaction with the professors, a small studio, but a very strong program. And my mom had gone to this institution, so she of course was all over it. And she raved about how wonderful West Michigan was as an area. So I kind of applied there that fall of my senior year. And then also at the senior year at my high school, we had to write this senior thesis. And it was a project that we'd actually begun our previous year in high school, which is it was a wonderful opportunity. And the whole premise of the thesis was that you had to begin, the first half was, understanding systematic theology from whatever tradition you came from. So for me, it was using the Westminster Confession and the Catechism. And then the second part was defending a sort of theological aspect of making an argument for the church, an apology for some aspect of theology. And then the third part was vocation. And you also wanted to have kind of a integration between those three parts. And so I'm going through the loci of this as a junior in high school. And what do you do as a Presbyterian when you get to angelology? What do you even do? So I began reading Aquinas on angels, because who else writes in the West on angels except for Aquinas? And I'm beginning to read this guy, and he's talking about the 9 choirs, and he's talking about, Satan's rebellion and the nature of demons and the nature of angels and the immaterial beings, and therefore they're, man is a superior creature, but they, transmit knowledge immediately because they don't have the physical function of the body. And I'm going there going like, I have never heard anything like this before, but it was amazing. Yeah. And I was like, and this guy actually believes what he's talking about.
I was going to say, I'm going to pause there with that, because I mean, with all those 9 choirs, bands, all that. But the point is, he takes it seriously.
He takes it seriously.
These are real things.
He's not just. I mean, he's not just making this off. I mean, he's.
He takes it seriously.
Yeah, he's taking it seriously.
Let's pause there, Jonathan. Let's come back. That's a great place to break. We'll be back just a moment with more of Jonathan's story. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi, and our guest is Jonathan Bading, former Calvinist. I've rudely interrupted him in the midst of finishing his thesis.
Well, right. So I was, so we were with Aquinas, right? And so I was looking at all these, you can get through sin with the Westminster, you can get through all these things, but then you really begin to look at Aquinas, and I go, what even is this? And then I began to reference back to the early exposure to Athanasius as well, and looked at Confessions a bit, because even Augustine has that lovely bit at the end of Confessions about music and him being drawn. He felt like it was a temptation to the carnal to love the music independently apart from what it was transmitting, and he had that big crisis with it, but at the end of the day he concludes, that music should still be there because it is worthy of the temple, because it is so beautiful. It's a big paraphrase, obviously. Anyway, and then what I wrote about my second part of the thesis was I was defending actually traditional church music. And I don't even remember what even I meant by traditional church music, but I essentially, as you know, in that world, there were just these very, intense debates about traditional hymnody versus praise and worship music. And there were those two camps, and they never agreed. And all of sacred music in the Protestant world can be summed up by those two camps. All of the debates are over those two things. And then how do we integrate them into contemporary forms? Or how do we integrate, and then you have your two congregations, right? You got your traditional service, you got your contemplative or contemporary service, or whatever you want. You have this kind of thing in Protestantism. So I was pretty much defending hymnody. The funny thing is you can invite family and friends to your thesis defense. And then, for the vocation section, I talked about being a church musician, because that's what I wanted to do. So we invited one of our assistant pastors from our church to come to this this thing, and I didn't really have a follow-up conversation with him, but I remember being like halfway through the thesis, delivering my thesis, and being like, what have I just argued? This is a severe departure from what I have been grown up from. I'm spiritually speaking as an Anglican and not really fitting within the Calvinistic approach to liturgy anymore. Anyway, so then that was a good end. I went off to college, began studying the organ there, and like I talked about, where I felt like as a keyboardist I couldn't lock into rhythm, I couldn't lock into how to feel confident, how to move the music as a keyboardist. My organ teacher, I truly think, is quite literally exercised me as an organist through 4 years of study, where he pretty much wrote back everything I had learned and pretty much retaught me. He built me back up as a keyboardist, and it's one of the most moving and one of the things I'm most proud of having gone through in my life, and what I'm grateful for him for, because it was quite a labor of love to do all of that too, and he's a wonderful pedagogue. But one of the things he said to me as a freshman, because I remember I played this Bach piece for him, and he was like, oh no, let's go through this. And he sat me down and he said, music, when you perform music, just like we talked about, you aren't creating music, you're merely revealing it. This music already exists in the cosmos. Then he starts talking about Boethius, and the music of the music of the spheres, which is Boethius' great thing. So Boethius is dangerous too, because he's a Roman philosopher and he's a Catholic, so you're already swimming in those waters. But Boethius talks about, that all of music exists in the universe, and we merely have manifestations of it here on Earth. And he essentially said that. He said, when you're playing the organ, especially at church, you are, any music whatsoever, it's like you're tuning into a radio station. And however well you play the music is how well the connection's coming in, Once again, that's totally reversing our entire modern idea of music. You don't create it. It's not a creative expression. It is revealing objective beauty in various expressions of it. And I think through that, I began to understand music on a whole different level, and one that actually I really do think led me into the Catholic faith, because you could apply that principle to every aspect of our theology too, right? Is that as Catholics, we are always, our entire liturgical life is appealing to the other, to heaven. And heaven comes and dwells among us in the liturgy, and it brings us the Sursum Corda, right? We lift our hearts up into heaven in the liturgy. So around this time, I'm remaining Anglican, but I'm kind of jaded towards Anglicans because I was part of this one obscure branch of Anglicans, and I came to West Michigan, but I couldn't find a church that would let me even commune because they barred me from communing because I wasn't part of their Anglican church. So I began going like, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing here. I had just started in a relationship with the girl I would marry. Her name was Madison, and she was a Baptist. And our opening conversations with our relationship was religion. And we would sit at lunch on Sundays after we both go to our respective churches. I was singing at a Dutch Reformed church at the time and couldn't stand it. And she would go to her Reformed Baptist church, and we would just talk about this stuff. And I'd been reading a lot of this Catholic stuff online, but I got to this point in my sophomore year where I was so depressed, couldn't feel like I was moving forward at all. I knew Orthodoxy wasn't the answer because I was a Westerner, and I loved the West, and I knew that it just wasn't natural for me to be Orthodox. Anglicanism had sputtered out. And I knew that Rome was the answer, but I didn't trust her yet. And I went to someone who's actually been a guest on the show, Dr. Jared Ortiz, who is a professor of religion at Hope. The one Catholic religious professor we have, I think. And I went to him and I said, look, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what's right. Can we get lunch and talk? And he's had this a lot in his time there, especially at a school like Hope. And he said, sure. So we went and got lunch. And the brilliant thing about his pedagogy was that, he didn't explain to me the Immaculate Conception. He explained to me purgatory. He didn't explain any of the red flags. He showed me the Catholic faith. And what he said, there was a winter break coming up, an academic break. And my girlfriend and I and a couple other friends were planning on going on this trip to Chicago, just around the lake, just for the weekend. And he said, when you go to Chicago this weekend, go to this parish, St. John Cantius on the north side. He said, I went there as a student when I was going to UChicago. Liturgically there, he said, just go there. He didn't say anything. So that was on a Monday. We're going to go to John Cantius on a Monday. On New Liturgical Movement, this website I've been reading since I was in high school, I saw this advertisement for this traditional Latin Mass with sung polyphony at this parish in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I went, what the heck? And the ironic thing about it was that Calvin College's choir was singing at this traditional Latin Mass. Now, Calvin colleges are a rival school, but they're the other half of the Dutch Reformed world. And they were singing at the traditional Latin Mass. So I told Madison, I said, do you want to go to this on the Sunday? So it was the first Sunday of Lent. And she said, sure, why not?
They were singing at the traditional Latin Mass?
They were singing Victoria, who was a Counter-Reformation composer. They were singing his Mass setting one of his Mass settings at this traditional Latin Mass. So we go to this, it was middle of February, we go into this parish on the west side of Grand Rapids, this old Polish parish, very Baroque, beautiful building. Stumble in. First thing we notice is that there's about 25 people lined up on the side of the church getting into this wooden box. We didn't see them getting to the wooden box, but we're like, is this penance? Are they standing for penance? Are they standing as a aesthetic discipline? We didn't realize they were in confession line. We hadn't started Mass yet. Then we start Mass. They proceed it. And I had seen processionals like that in Anglicanism, but smells and bells and the incense was going, and Father had Beretta on, and I was very impressed by that. And then the introit began. So the choir began doing Gregorian chant, which is something I had studied a little bit in college. And I was like, okay, this is really cool. This is really something else. And the priest gets up there and he begins to pierce at the foot of the altar. And then he ascends the altar steps and they begin the Kyrie, and it's a 6-voice Renaissance polyphony. And I wept like a baby. And I was in ecstasy for the rest of the Mass. I mean, that was the moment in my life where I said, like, this has to be it. I said, I don't know why this has to be it, but this has to be it because Christ revealed himself to me in his liturgy. And I knew that intellectually the church was it, but I didn't trust her yet because I didn't actually see her living. And for me, it was the traditional Latin Mass, which, like a lot of my peers, I would say, there's kind of this trend in Catholicism right now with a lot of us being interested in the traditional Latin Mass, being devotees of it. It was that which really first said, I need to become a Roman Catholic. And that Mass was just ecstasy. And I knew that it was Christ on the altar. I knew that it was Christ that the priest was elevating. I had this just a sense of the real presence for the first time. I never wanted to leave that again. Kind of like, I know Newman talks about that, with going back to Anglican churches after he converted and being like, they're cold. There's a coldness there, because the real presence never leaves you. It implants himself on you. And anyway, soon thereafter, we went to John Cantor's that weekend too, so that was just another punch, because we went to Compline there. We got there in the evening. We went to Compline with the canons. We had a young priest there who said, you guys don't look familiar to this. He gave us a whole tour of the entire place. He showed us all the altars, all the side altars, all the relics, which was huge, right? Because that's full Catholicism, full fire hose, you know? And I said, I really want to, it was a crazy, amazing weekend. So then I went back to Dr. Ortiz. And I said to Dr. Ortiz, have you ever heard of this church, Sacred Heart, in Westside of Grand Rapids? He says, oh, I'm on the board of the academy there and whatnot. I said, you got to be kidding me. So anyway, he said, I know the director of music there, and I'll connect you guys. And I said, sure, because I was looking for a church job. Church musicians aren't that well off going through school. So I got conversation with this director of music, Daniel Page, there at this parish. He came out to Holland actually to see me, which is very nice. And we began talking. I found out he was a convert from Anglicanism himself. We began talking about books I was reading. And then he said, come sing for me in the fall. You know, I hire university singers to come sing. Come sing for me. I went to go sing for him. And then we began RCIA at that time. And from there, it was pretty quick. We came in at Easter. Madison actually was studying abroad in the spring. So she came in at Corpus Christi when she came home. But I came in at Easter of 17.
I was wondering whether Madison was having the same journey at the same time.
So yeah, we went in the RSAA. I remember we went into our religious ed director's office and just kind of said, we want to get married. We believe the Catholic Church teaching. We don't know. We want to be Catholic. We don't know what to do. La da 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 la da da da. Kind of threw everything on him. He just said, okay, stop. Take one day at a time. See what happens. And we both went in saying, if one of us wants to swim and the other one doesn't, then that's okay, but which was so naive, because the whole process actually sanctified our relationship and really, I would say, brought us to the altar, literally, but also truly prepared us for marriage. So she came in at Corpus Christi. Those summers, so the summer before I converted and the summer after I converted, I had an opportunity to, with an art history professor at my college, to go over to France and study music manuscripts in a monastery. So study 14th century chant manuscripts and catalog them. And that was providential too, because I fell in love with what is the real liturgical music of the church. And I fell in love with chant. I fell in love with liturgical culture and the monastic living. And I had the opportunity the second summer to go to daily mass at this small 13th century parish in France. And I was like, this is just amazing, you know? And then when I came back, that Christmas, it was actually the Christmas before I came into the Catholic faith, our director of music at this parish got sick. He was hospitalized for a week, and Christmas week. And so the director of religious ed, who I was in RCIA with, called me and said, will you sub for Christmas? And I said, sure. So I had to do all the Christmas masses on the fly. I had to direct the choir, I had to play the organ. And then when this director of music left the next year, Priest Father Sirico, he came to me and said, well, you've already had your audition, for this job. Do you want the job, essentially? I was finishing up my senior year of school, so it's a dream job. And there I was. All Saints was my first mass. I remember being in the direction. I was doing a Latin mass for All Saints, going, how the heck did I get here when I did? But it was one thing opened after another, and now I am a parish musician. Direct 2 choirs. Sacred Heart Parish in Grand Rapids is going through an interesting phase right now. We're working on rejuvenating our culture and leading that rejuvenation with the liturgy, that we believe that, the church's old maxim is lex orandi, lex credendi. The law of prayer is the law of belief, and that everything flows out of the wellspring of the church. And so what we're trying to do is revive the liturgical life of our parish through excellence in music, in art, in liturgical celebration. Also working in Benedict XVI's vision of Summorum Pontificum with mutual enrichment, that the ordinary form will benefit from the extraordinary form, and the extraordinary form will benefit from the ordinary form, and that they work together to get us through some of the mess we're in terms of liturgy. Yeah.
Oh, well, awesome. Wow, lots of questions. I remember when I was a pastor, as a Presbyterian, and every week I had to plan the worship.
Yeah.
We didn't have liturgical, but we had a structure. But I remember choosing the hymns, and I remember even though I was well trained in music, the only criteria that I used when I planned these different hymns was, is this a vertical hymn or a horizontal hymn?
Right.
So like Amazing Grace is a horizontal hymn.
Right.
Because you're telling the people next to you about your experience of God.
Right.
Whereas Holy, Holy, Holy is a vertical hymn. It's a prayer. And so that was the only rule of thumb.
We had.
But there's more to it than that.
Yeah.
Talk about how one understands the place of music
in the church.
Mass.
I think the biggest change for me in leaving Protestantism and becoming Roman Catholic was the question in Protestantism is, what do you sing when you worship God? What parts of the service do you sing? The question in Catholicism is, what parts do you not sing? It's totally an opposite thought. I mean, the liturgy of the church forever has been a sung occasion. And the reason why we do that is because when you sing something, you can't argue it. You're not making a defense for it. You're not making an apology for it. There's no rhetoric involved with it. You're merely proclaiming it. It's the only function that singing can do. You're merely proclaiming what is there. And I think when I understood the traditional liturgy of the church, that there were texts and functions of texts, functioning texts that existed in the Mass, like your propers, right? So the introit accompanies the action of the priest as he's preparing for Mass. The gradual, now a lot of times the responsorial psalm, but in the Old Mass, the gradual and the Alleluia is what transitions the priest from the epistle into the gospel. The offertory, when the priest begins his ablutions, it begins blessing the gifts, which will then become our Lord. That is accompanied by this text, which is a reflection on that. You know, all of these aspects of the Mass, that they have a literal function. They're not garnish, but they actually literally function, and they have functioned that way for all of time, with little revision. And that these texts, these psalm texts, St. Jerome says, that psalms are the mouthpiece of the church. Well, we are constantly drawing from that mouthpiece in everything we do. And so the question of what's vertical and what's horizontal doesn't really exist, because it's all just objective. It's the objective music of the church. And you have this big question of, okay, what then kind of music is then worthy of the temple, which is a humongous question. I think the best attempt in our modern era at it was with St. Pius X, who wrote about, that the music has to be universal, has to be holy, has to be beautiful, and that it also has to stem from the organic music of the church, which is, I would say, Gregorian chant. So that our polyphony and the music of the church, even our organ music, has to stem from the pathos and the ethos of that primitive and what I would say the source and the summit of our church music too, which is the chant. It's both like the foundation of everything, but also what we return to as well.
Yeah, we've become so spoiled, if you will, in our generation. We've got a catechism. In fact, we might have 3 catechisms at home.
Yeah, right.
I might have a dozen Bibles at home. We got books everywhere.
Yeah, right.
But for the majority of the history of the church, majority of Catholics couldn't read and didn't have books.
Exactly.
But they could sing.
Yes.
And it was the singing that communicated the substance of the faith.
Yes.
For the majority of this period.
And what they received in the Mass, they had a real better sense of oral participation, that we contemplate through the music, that we can contemplate God through art, through music. Then they would take that and they would build a beautiful music culture on the outside of the church's walls that flowed out of the liturgy. So and that carried all the way through into the modern era. So when you're having this question of the Western society has fallen apart, what are we going to do about our opera houses? What are you going to do about the symphony? The way you redeem those things is you redeem church music. If you redeem church music, if you redeem the holiness of Mother Church's liturgy, then you will redeem the music of society as well.
You go in some of these absolutely beautiful older churches, which are now amplified with electronics. And you can't hear a word what's being said, because they were designed, they were created for the singing. Yeah.
And the only part that you would speak is, the sermon, and then you have your little, what is it called? I can't even think of the term, the dome that would then project the sound over into the people. Or you'd put the lectern right in the middle of the ambo right in the middle of the people as well. But everything else is why they have domes above, the altars, yes, we are in the action of ascending into heaven. That's why we have domes. That's why you have the Pantocrator on the top of the dome, right? All of that. But at the same time, it's also pragmatic.
Yeah.
You got to hear Father sing, you know? Yeah. You got to hear what's going on. The choir's got to sit there and they sing as well, and the dome projects that. I love it when our mic system breaks. So.
Well, yeah. Well, of course, the problem is that many of the speakers, we haven't exercised those vocal cords anymore to project. I was telling somebody, if you want to look the way they used to preach, go on YouTube and find when Billy Graham preached in Yankee Stadium in the 1960s.
Right.
That was...
And he could do it.
He could project. Even though he had microphones, it didn't matter. He was projecting, and we've kind of lost it. Chant, though. Let's talk about chant. My son, Peter, who's finishing up seminary, he's doing a thesis on chant.
Oh, no way.
But talk about the significance of chant as that thread that goes through to make all of the music meaningful, if you will.
Right. The beautiful thing about chant is that you can trace musicologically, you can trace its substance all the way back to what was probably sung in the temple in the Jewish day. And the reason it's not rhythmed as we know it, it's not rhythmed as it's in a meter, but it takes on the rhythm of the spoken word, but it elevates it, right? So if you listen to Gregorian chant, it's not 3/4, it's not 4/4. It doesn't like you would with certain types of music. It's a free rhythm, but it models the cadence of human speaking. So in that, it elevates the proclamation of the gospel that much. And then at the same time, I think there's a real beautiful incarnational aspect of it, that the Holy Spirit breathes into chant, right? So when you have your melismas, when you have one syllable over a significant word and you're just singing through that syllable, you are allowing yourself to contemplate, like Lectio Divina, you're allowing yourself to contemplate what the verbum is, that and how the Holy Spirit has breathed into that microcosm of the entire faith.
Yeah.
So.
Well, real quick email from David from Georgia.
Yeah.
I'm a new convert to the Catholic Church, and my previous faith background wasn't liturgical at all. I'm having a hard time with all the rote prayers and some of the music in Latin that I don't understand.
Right.
In my opinion, my previous church seemed to have a much more dynamic worship experience. What does Johnson suggest for me to get more out of the Mass, and better appreciate liturgical worship? I'm intellectually Catholic, but don't feel at home in the church on Sundays yet.
Right. Two things. One, I would say, don't feel the need immediately to participate in absolutely everything. The Mass is the eternal wellspring. There's always things there will all be new aspects of the Mass that you'll contemplate. So the best thing I can say is sit back and pray through the music. The music is not validated by you participating in it. The music exists outside of you. That's a historic understanding of Catholic music. So don't feel the pressure to sing. Pray through the music that is being sung. If you want to practically learn the music, join your choir. I speak as a choir director, and it's a selfish intention, but join a choir if you want to actually learn that aspect of it. But I also would say, and a great venue to experience that sort of contemplative participation before you enter into the actual music and the actual Latin rhythms of everything is to experience a traditional Latin Mass, because it allows that for you. It doesn't demand verbal participation as much as even the Novus Ordo may seem to. You can still contemplate the Novus Ordo, but the traditional Latin Mass, really you get the sense of I can be here and God will speak to me and I don't have to sing to him, at least with my voice. So there's a patience there that I think you have to adjust to.
Thinking about your first experience there at your first Mass, it's in my experience as a Catholic, in all the places I've been, it seems that when you're trying to capture that aspect of the Catholicism, it may be hard in your local parish, depending on when it was built and the way it's done. But all my experiences, usually if I make a visit to the cathedral, a meditative visit to my local cathedral is a connection with Mother Church in a way. I particularly think of, for example, the cathedral up in Toledo, Ohio, which is an absolutely beautiful, beautiful.
I've seen it.
And I'm wondering, is that a good advice to many of our people? Go to the cathedral, and you might get more of an experience of connectivity than you might at
your local parish. Your cathedral or your basilica, that which has been noted for its beauty, for its architecture, go to a place where you really can contemplate those mysteries in the space of the church. and where there's actually literal space for you to contemplate those mysteries. Yeah, I think that's really sound advice.
All right, Jonathan, thank you so much
Hey, thanks for having
sharing
me.
your journey
Appreciate it.
on the program. And
Yeah.
God bless you and your continued beautiful work.
Thank you. Appreciate
with
it.
music. Thank you very much. And those of you who joined us today, I want to remind you to check out chnetwork.org, our website. You'll find out more journeys like Jonathan's, as well as resources to help you discover this great, beautiful church that our Lord has given to us. God bless you. See you again next week.